Marjorie Mead, Interim Director of the Wade Center, and it's just a joy to have all of you here tonight. And this is just a really special evening. We have two wonderful speakers who have given a joint lecture here before on the book that they wrote together, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And if you were here that night, you'll know how wonderful it is to have the two of them partnering on things. But let me just take a moment to introduce our speakers. Dr. Jerry Root is Associate Professor of Evangelism and Leadership at Wheaton College, Director of the Evangelism Initiative in the Billy Graham Center. Jerry's been a member of the Wade Board since 1989 and just a good friend of all of ours here. And nothing gives us more pleasure than to have Jerry here. Jerry's also a well-known and well-established Lewis scholar, prolific writer on Lewis, and he lectures worldwide, literally, and is a very sought-after speaker. Mark is the VP of Digital Marketing for C. Grant & Company, a firm specializing in working with higher ed, nonprofits, publishers, and other businesses. And Jerry and Mark have been friends for, I don't know, quite a while, and have a wonderful way of working through and thinking through things together. So we're going to benefit from that. This is the first in a series of 4 lectures under the general title of The Neglected Lewis, C.S. Lewis, and it's some of Lewis's best things are less well known, and that's what Jerry and Mark are going to help us see. And I have never read literary criticism that's as interesting as what C.S. Lewis writes. So Jerry's going to start us off this evening, and so let me just ask Jerry to come up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marge. I'm really grateful to you, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work with Mark again. It was true, we were here after The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis came out, and it's really nice to see Julie Mitchell here because we dedicated that to her husband, Chris, shortly after he passed away, also to her. And our reason for that was because Chris was one of my best friends, and he was one of Mark's really important mentors, and we both loved him deeply. But anyway, now it's time to turn attention to something else. Let's pray, though. Father, I thank you for the privilege we have of considering some of Lewis's literary critical works. Help us to have our hearts inflamed with desire for you, connected to our minds as we think through these issues. Fill us with your Spirit for this time and give each person what he or she needs in this hour. We ask this in Christ's name, amen. It's been my impression that Lewis's literary critical works are his best works, and nobody reads them. And so to talk about this evening, in a sense, we're doing 2 things. Number one, we're trying to reveal out of a gratitude to Lewis, the place where his mind was forged as he thought through literary critical issues and then brought that mind to the world of Christian apologetics, as well as brought his background in texts to the writing of his fiction. So that's one. Number 2, it's to alert readers what great material this is so that they will in turn go on and read some of this stuff. I think they'll be surprised. I begin this lecture with a little background, though. Mark and I are basically taking one of Lewis's earliest works in literary criticism, The Personal Heresy, and Mark's going to take one of his last works in literary criticism, and we're going to show that bookended, basically there's a skeletal structure. While Lewis may flesh it out in different ways, similarly, he's operating from a pretty clear understanding of how we would assess a text. And part of this, again by background, is that Lewis was an objectivist. That means that Lewis believed there were knowers, subjects, and there were objects, things to be known, whether they be an object of material value or an object of thought that one could set apart by definition and reason inferentially to some sort of conclusion. And Lewis, because he was an objectivist, some people have tried to classify him as a person infected by rationalist presuppositions, Enlightenment rationalism. It's not true. His objectivism goes further back to things that we might find in Scripture, to things that we would find in the ancient Greeks, to things that we would find in the medieval scholastics. And Lewis's objectivist commitments he puts forth most dramatically in his book, The Abolition of Man, a book that Mortimer Adler included in the Great Books of the Western World in 1968. But Lewis wrote The Personal Heresy, and when he wrote The Personal Heresy, he was combating, in a sense, what he saw as subjectivistic approaches to literature, things that took a person away from the text and instead riveted attention on the author. Throughout Lewis's literary career, after he wrote The Personal Heresy, he will address these things in many other places. For example, he writes in Surprised by Joy about that tendency, and also in Experiment Criticism, the tendency to read between the lines, to begin to make assessments of what the author meant when there's no text that validates this. And consequently, Lewis says the person who reads between the lines shows that he can't read the lines. Next is the doctrine of the unchanging human heart, where Lewis says there will be people who will say, well, I'm like everybody else who ever wrote. The caveman was an artist. That's not much different than I am. So consequently, then we take ourselves and project ourselves on any text thinking it's proximate to us because we understand as humans what this other human understood. Lewis said, no, the greatness of man is his elasticity of nature, that he could be so different from age to age and time to time. And we want to understand each expression of this wonder of what it means to be human. Historicism is another one. Historicism is when we begin to project on history where it's going. He says, we don't know where it's going. We can say there's interesting characters, there were interesting events. But when you start to say you know where it's going and we don't know where it's going, again, attention is riveted on the interpreter. And then chronological snobbery was another one. We can think that because we live in this day, everybody else before us was primitives. I asked my students, how many of you think there was a time when academics actually believed the world was flat? 100% of them raised their hands. And I just say that shows you how provincial you are. You never read the Ovid by Metamorphose. He talks about the sphere of the earth 70, 80 years before the birth of Christ. Or the Timaeus by Plato, he talks about the sphere of the earth, 300 years before Christ. We're just not very well read, and so consequently, we think that we're better and everybody before us was primitive. Newton said, if I've seen farther than others, it was seated on the shoulders of giants. Instead, we've got people who are saying, basically, it's amazing we got on as well as we did, given the pygmies that preceded us. And it's crazy. Psychoanalysis and literary criticism is another one. We try to psychoanalyze the author rather than dealing with the text. The author's not there. How do we psychoanalyze him? Sounds like an evening broadcast trying to decide the psychological state of the president or something like that. The anthropological approach is another example where rather than talking about the text, we try to describe how the text came to be. And he says we're not there. And so consequently, it's usually guesses, and again, it rivets the attention on the interpreter. And there's another essay at the fringe of language at the end of Studies in Words, where Lewis says he remembered this one critic who you never knew anything about the book after you read what the critic said. All you knew was the critic's likes and dislikes. And yet the critic never explained why the likes or dislikes was merited. With this in mind, now we come to Tilliard's book. And Tilliard was a teacher of English at Cambridge University. Later, he would become the master of Jesus College, Cambridge. He was an eminent academic. Even in his day, Lewis's career was just getting launched at this time. The two of them engaged in the debate. To Tilliard's credit, that he was willing to take time with rather a young scholar coming on. Says an awful lot about Tilliard's magnanimity. But nevertheless, Tilliard had written a book on Milton's Paradise Lost, and it came out in 1930. And in it, he said, Paradise Lost is about nothing other than the state of Milton's mind when he wrote the book. Well, Lewis took issue with this. He says, how do you make a judgment about the state of an author's mind? You don't know if your judgments are right or not because you don't have access to the author's mind. And so consequently, Lewis published an article in a work called Essays and Studies, and it was an annual journal published by the English Association at Oxford University. This essay came out in 1934. Remember, Lewis became a Christian in 1931. His first great academic book is The Allegory of Love. It comes out in 1936. Lewis was really a no-name guy. He publishes this article maybe he wrote it in 33, 2 years after his conversion. and several years before the allegory of love, and several years before the personal heresy actually comes out in 1939. He argued against Tilliard's assumptions in his work on Milton. In the 1935 journal, Tilliard responded to Lewis. In the 1936 journal, Lewis gave a rebuttal to Tilliard. And the two of them said, hey, this is kind of fun, let's do something with it. The remarkable thing about the debate between them, I haven't ever been able to find one ad hominem in the debate. We're looking for an age where people could discuss things of difference, where they breathe light and not heat. And Lewis and Tilliard are a perfect model of that. Everybody should read it, at least for that example, to sort of give ourselves a mouthwash to see what a good debate looks like instead of some of the nonsense we hear today. Well, as the debate goes on, Lewis starts to make his argument as to say why it's not just about the author's mind and why there's something of merit in the text itself. As mentioned, Lewis challenges Tilliard's claim that Milton's Paradise Lost is really about the true state of the author's mind when he wrote it. For brevity, Lewis calls the approach Tilliard takes the personal heresy, caught up in the person of the author rather than caught up in what the author has to say. Lewis then begins to make his case, citing reasons why the text does not provide access to the state of the author's mind when he wrote. First, he said, when an author describes a state of emotion, the author in that state or removed from the state and is now looking at that state of mind by recollection. If you've read Surprised by Joy, you'll know that Lewis said that he was trying to figure out the difference between enjoying something, experiencing it, or looking at it. He later would write an essay called Meditations in a Toolshed about this very thing. He went to a lecture at Oxford by Samuel Alexander, who published the book Space, Time, and Deity. It's a 2-volume work. I've got it. The only thing worth reading is the first chapter where Alexander sets aside the enjoyment is to be in the thing, the contemplating is to look at it. And Lewis says to Tilliard, using what he had learned way back then, if the author is writing about some emotion, he's looking at it. It's not in his mind at all. He's not experiencing it, he's writing about it. He's moved away from the experience of it. And then Lewis goes on to say, theater would be an example. Where's the mind of the author when he writes theater or she writes plays? You give voice to all the characters. Which one represents the author's character? It's not necessarily inside the author's mind. Lewis says, let it be granted, however, that I do approach the poet. At least I do it by sharing his consciousness, not by studying it. I look with his eyes, but not at him. So there is some place where we come together. But Lewis goes on to say, to see things as the poet sees them, I must share his consciousness and not attend to it. I must look where he looks and not turn around to face him. I must make of him not a spectacle, but a pair of spectacles. That's a good one, right? Dick Geezer for an ophthalmologist. I must enjoy him and not contemplate him. Lewis then asks about the class of poetical experiences in which the consciousness that we share cannot possibly be attributed to any single individual. And here he looks at a text of Scripture, the book of Isaiah. Now, this is Lewis early in his Christian faith, and he seems to have a sort of higher critical view of Isaiah, thinking it might have multiple authors. We find Lewis moves away from that view, and you can find it in one of the last essays he writes, Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism. But early on, as a new Christian, probably in the academic world, he was familiar with higher criticism. He says, so who wrote Isaiah? If it has multiple authors, how do you say it's all about the state of the author's mind when he wrote? And this problem is exacerbated when it comes to the translation of the book of Isaiah. Whose mind is it then? The translators or the original authors and so on? Furthermore, authors engage in the use of what Lewis later called the shared imagination. It's the assumption, Mark and I talked about it last time we were here, it's the assumption that the audience matters. And if an author wants to connect with the author has to bring into recollection some shared experience that the audience has had. And then as they described it, the audience says, oh yeah, I get that. Or the reader of the book, oh yeah, I get that. Whose mind is then at play? Lewis is writing this with just great logic and great sense. It's pretty remarkable. And then he goes on to say, the idea of the author is such that the author is a window into something. He writes, a poet does what no one else can do, what perhaps no other poet can do. but he does not express his personality. His own personality is his starting point and his limitation. It is analogous to the position of a window. If he remains at his starting point, he's no poet. As long as he is, like the rest of us, a mere personality, all is still to do. It is his business, starting from his own consciousness, whatever that may happen to be, to find that arrangement of public experiences embodied in words which will admit him, and incidentally us, to a new mode of consciousness. He proceeds partly by instinct, partly by following the tradition of his predecessors, but very largely by the method of trial and error. And the result, when it comes, is for him no less than for us an acquisition, a voyage beyond the limits of his personal point of view, an annihilation of the brute fact of his own particular psychology rather than its assertion. And so Lewis goes on to say, if our attention is focused on the window, then it must be a bad window, or it's not a clean one. We want to see beyond the window to what is visible beyond it. And lastly, Lewis acknowledges that many authors in his day were materialists. He, I think, suspects that maybe Tilliard leaned that way. But the materialists will tell you, as Lewis will later develop in Miracles, that the lovers are not really in love. The man sees the woman, her image is projected on the retina of the man's eye. Through a series of electrical synapses, the message is carried along the optic nerve, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. And he says it's love, but the materialist says, no, it's just chemistry. It's all matter. The problem is the materialist always wants you to believe, though, what he or she asserts is to be taken as truth, but it's also affected by the same circumstances. So consequently, Lewis says when the person's a materialist, if they think that the personality of the poet matters, all they've taken us to is a chemistry lab. And so this becomes problematic too. So Tilliard responds, and he responds by seeking to define terms such as personal and personality in order to add clarity to his side of the debate. I would have to say that in reality, he doesn't offer any clarity. He starts defining personality in multiple numbers of ways, which leaves the reader somewhat confused. But then Tilliard goes on to say, of course, Mr. Lewis does not confine personal to the trivial or accidental sense. He grants that it is possible through poetry to come in contact with the poet's temperament in the most intimate way. Again, seeing with his eyes rather than looking at him. The reader shares the poet's consciousness. So Tilliard here turns Lewis's words around, suggesting that Lewis is granting Tilliard's point when that hasn't been the case at all. Concerned that terms such as personal and personality ought to be properly defined, Tilliard then introduces the term normal personality. Later he talks about remarkable personality. Later he talks about someone whose personality impresses us, and the whole thing is a jumble. I'd like to go into more detail about this, but I need to get to the end of the book. And so while there's much back and forth here, and so on, there's something that we need to look at, and that's when Tilliard, at the end of the second round of debate, where he moves no further in supporting his idea, Tilliard finally gets to place at the end of his second set of comments, well, Lewis is good about telling me what's wrong with my theory. Maybe he needs to give us his theory of poetry. He puts it like this. We have... he says, whatever anyone might say about Tilliard's arguments, Lewis scholarship owes him a great debt, for at the end of this one chapter, Tilliard asks, Mr. Lewis has said much about what literature is not, little about what it is. If it does not express the author's personality, should he not tell us what it does express? He has indeed dropped a few hints. I await eagerly his expansion of them. All Lewis scholarship owes a great debt to that comment, because it forced Lewis then to start to write out his theory of poetry. And it's fabulous. And let me sort of break it down for you. And this now is where I'll take the rest of my time, and I'll do a little more reading because some of this is complex, but I want us to get what Lewis said. Lewis begins this chapter by noting, in his last essay, Dr. Tilliard is kind enough to express a hope that our controversy is gradually bringing us into agreement. In certain respects, I think it is, and even where agreement may not be possible, the grounds of disagreement are being made clearer. Before Lewis outlines his theory of poetry, he feels it's necessary to say something about the real world, the very world from which the poet draws his inspiration. He says of the real world that it has a downright interestingness, which meets or even besieges us daily whenever we are not ill or tired or preoccupied. In the mid-30s, so right around the time Lewis is writing this, he gives a lecture at Oxford University called The English Syllabus. And in this, he says to the students at Oxford University, we have fulfilled our whole duty to you if we can help you see some given tract of reality. That is, there's a world that exists independent of you, different from you, an objective reality to which you must bring your subjective understanding in alignment. Adjust the scoliosis of your mind, your will, your emotion to that objective reality. As long as you're not doing that, as long as you're focusing on the author of a text or focusing on yourself as a critic of the text, you are missing the opportunity to make those kinds of adjustments. So there's this downright interestingness. Lewis never wants an approach to poetry that would focus our attention on authors and miss this. Consequently, Lewis marks two types of symbols used in human speech, for example, one found in the world of mathematics and one in poetry. He writes, the algebraical symbol comes naked into the world of mathematics and is clothed with value by its masters. But a poetic symbol, like a rose for love and Guillaume Delory, comes trailing clouds of glory from the real world, clouds whose shapes and color largely determine and explain its poetic use. In an equation, X and Y will do as well as A and B, but the romance of the rose could not without loss be rewritten as the romance of the onion. And if a man did not see why, we could only send him back to the real world to study roses, onions, and love, all of them still untouched by poetry, still raw, the very stuff that poetry ought to be about. Then Lewis writes that these preliminaries are important for the theory of poetry, which I am presently going to propound in an answer to the challenge delivered at the end of Tilliard's essay. But Lewis has already given us, in a sense, a prequel to what's coming, because he is pointing to this real world that people need to write about. Now Lewis sets forth his theory of poetry. Lewis sets forth principles regarding literary judgment, which then must be applied to specific cases. Of course, there's always a possibility the application may fall below the standard. Nevertheless, an abuse does not nullify a proper use, as Thomas Aquinas reminded us. If objective judgments can be made at all, if questions about beauty can be settled, and national parks be guarded to protect natural wonders, and museums built to preserve works of art for the pleasures of generations to come, then we should expect guiding principles might be deduced that would prove to be helpful, and these should transcend the subjective state of those who conceive the enterprise of parks and museums. There are rules to the game of reason and literary judgment, just as there are rules to the game of chess. Knowing the rules does not guarantee I win the game every time I sit down to play. Skill and application of the rules is necessary as well. And in light of this, Lewis does believe objective judgments are possible in matters of beauty and art because something is exhibited before the senses. It can be described and talked about as something other than a mere extension of the self. Furthermore, descriptions of the thing can develop the more the work of art is studied. The scoliosis of my judgment can be adjusted to this plumb line of reality. And this adjusted understanding can be the work of one over time, or the work of a community that adds perspective by means of a variety of perspectives and angles of vision, or it can be the work of generations revealing the enduring quality of some objects that seem to transcend time and space. So how did Lewis set forth his principles for literary judgment rooted in the texts themselves? First, Lewis defines his terms. He writes, by poetry, I mean imaginative literature, whether in prose or verse. Then he says, furthermore, the poet's materials also set him apart. Lewis says that poetry is an art or skill, and a skill is defined by its instruments. The instrument of poetry is language. Since language can be used for purposes other than poetry, uses such as philosophy, commerce, science, and so on, the poet must use language in a particular way. The skill of the poet, as the skill of any artist with regard to his or her materials, provides another objective basis of valuation. Did the poet use the skill well? This has nothing to do with the artist's character or intention. A craftsman may be well-intended even when his skill may be lacking. And furthermore, an artist with poor personal character may be brilliantly skilled. We may not like the lifestyle of the artist, but as Lewis has made clear, the judgment is not about the artist, but about the art. If the material of the poet is language, and language can be used in a variety of ways, Lewis seeks to focus attention on the particular ways language might be used by the artist. I hope you're seeing the precision of his thinking all the way through this, so that you begin to see when he starts to turn this on defense of the faith, why his apologetics are beneficial to us because of this kind of thoughtfulness. He said, if the material of the poet is language, and language can be used in a variety of ways, Lewis seeks to focus attention on the particular ways language might be used by the artist. The scientist, he notes, modifies language for the sake of quantification and measurement. The scientist may say the temperature is below freezing. The scientist escapes from the sensuous altogether into the world of pure quantities. The poet, on the other hand, modifies common language to enable the reader to feel the very quality of the experience. The poet may use an analogy to say what it feels like to be in weather below freezing. Feels like a slap in the face. Poetry uses its tools, extra-logical elements of language, rhythm, vowel music, onomatopoeia, associations. One might add metaphors, similes, and analogy to convey the concrete reality of the experience, to bring us into it sensually. Well, Lewis has given some, certainly not all, basis for making some judgments regarding literary art and beauty. Does the reality support the claim? Has the poet used the tools well? He seeks to prevent the false notion that ambiguity in these matters might be eliminated. Lewis writes, "It is therefore not usually possible and never necessary to say of a composition in any absolute way, this is poetry. What we can say is, this is further in the poetical direction than that. Then it is the burden of the critic to explain why this is so, tethering his or her observation to the text." In this regard, Lewis says, in ordinary terminology, we mean by a tall man or a rich man one who is taller or richer than most. So by a poem, we mean a composition which communicates more of the concrete qualitative than our usual utterances do. A poet is a person who produces such compositions more often and more successfully than the rest of us. In one sense, all men and women are poets, in the sense that they can and do exploit the extra-logical properties of language to produce utterances of the concrete which have a value higher than zero. We do not usually call them poets, just as I'm not called a carpenter, though I could pound a nail, nor a doctor, though I know how to apply a Band-Aid. A generalization is not a thing in itself. It's an abstraction. Lewis explains, in space and time, there's no such thing as an organism. There are only animals and vegetables. There are no mere vegetables, only trees, flowers, turnips, and so forth. That there are no trees except beeches, elms, oaks, and the rest. There is no such thing as an elm. There is only this elm, in such a year of its age, at such an hour of this day. Thus lighted, this moving, thus acted on by all the past and all the present, and affording such and such experiences to me and my dog and the insect on its trunk and the man 1,000 miles away who's remembering it. A real elm, in fact, can be uttered only by a poem. The sort of things we meet in poetry are the only sort we meet in life, things unique, individual, lovely, or hateful. Unfortunately, however, poetry does not, as poetry, tell us whether the particular ones she describes do in fact exist. Only science can tell you where and when you are likely to meet an elm. Only poetry can tell you what meeting an elm is like. We abstract to inquire whether God exists. Dante shows you what it would be like if he did. You begin to see even the flavor of Lewis's apologetics starting to come out, even in something so early as this work. Having defined poetic language and distinguished it from abstract or scientific language, Lewis notes, but language must be about something. You cannot just say, you must say this or that. To see things as different as ourselves. The critic who only speaks of his likes and dislikes of a work tells us nothing of the work itself. Without an adequate description, a reader cannot determine if the critic's likes and dislikes have merit. Poetry, Lewis says, is an exploitation of language to convey the concrete. The means are art. The thing conveyed, said, or uttered is not. It is everybody's business. Lewis concludes his argument by saying, at the end of the day, a good poem should have two particular qualities. First, the story must be interesting. It comes back to the word interesting again. Something other than ourselves. If it's just an extension of ourselves, that's not so interesting. We're already familiar with that. That is, it should arouse interest. It should awaken interest. By interesting, he means it is not projection. In fact, Lewis says, we lose ourselves, not in the poet, but in that wherein he is lost, in the adventure of Caruso, the flowing of the Oxus, or the rotundity of Falstaff. He writes of that form of poetry that communicates such experiences as all men have had, so that simple readers exclaim, how true! And classicists call it a just representation of general nature, just because it renders to the thing its due. And realists say that the poet is stripping off the mask of convention and facing the facts. Classicists say, just as rendering to the nature, again, which is due, as if to say the heavens declare the glory of God and the earth reveals his handiwork. It is a wooing, demanding response, and the realist stripping off the mask remove the pretense from man and reveal the fact of the one who stands beneath all that is clearly seen in what is made. Perhaps we can even have a hint in this comment of something Lewis will say, until we have faces. How can we meet the gods face to face? Until we have faces. Lewis then remarks, it is the message, not the messenger, that has my heart. This drives Lewis's theory of poetry. Nature should awaken desire, and when the poet writes well, he or she becomes a servant of a wooing God. Whether they're a believer or not, when they point to reality, as Calvin says, God dons the garment of creation, and something of God is exhibited. It is not an act of manipulation, it is an act of speaking the truth, either clearly or hiddenly. Sometimes God himself hides, but unmistakably in his power to awaken desire and set the reader in a famished quest for living bread. To see things as different than ourselves. This is the full circle Lewis's objectivist has come to. And that world is seen as a place where desire is awakened, not only for this world, to understand it better, but for the world beyond. And then he says the second thing poetry should do, besides arousing in us the interestingness of the thing itself, the nature of this arousal, these interesting features, Lewis says, should have a desirable, permanent effect on us if possible. It should make us either happier or wiser or better. But a permanent effect. It awakens in us a desire that won't be satisfied until we connect with the permanent, the ultimate, and so on. Well, let me say a few words then about the benefit of this book. One, because of Tilliard's charge, Lewis exhibited this very early expression of what he felt poetry was, what he felt literary criticism should be. It's one of the earliest expressions in his writings. And it's wonderful. You read it, it takes your breath away, the things that he wrote. I can't do it justice. Second, the book is of value because it shows us what, again, a good debate between two brilliant people can be like when it breeds light and not heat. And I think, thirdly, it's important because there is one author who wrote a book. His name was Australian scholar A.J.A. Waldock. He wrote a book on Paradise Lost and its critics. And he basically makes most of the book the discussion of this debate. He's pretty convinced Lewis won the debate. But he said what Lewis failed to do was ever give us a literary critical exposition of Paradise Lost. So Milton had done it. Milton went into the lion's cage. It was time for Lewis to do it. And in some senses, we have the benefit then too, that Lewis actually goes in and produces for us, out of this debate, I think, his own A Preface to Paradise Lost. Well, anyway, that's it for A Personal Heresy. I hope you all go read it. You can see my copy is falling apart. Anyway, blessings.